The first time Lieutenant Commander Hayes saw the photograph, he didn't believe it. The image showed an A-10 Thunderbolt II sitting on the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, its titanium bathtub scarred with impacts that should have killed the pilot 3 times over. But it wasn't the damage that made his hands shake as he held the printout in the pre-flight briefing room. It was the bullet holes that had torn through the American flag painted on the vertical stabilizer, perfectly centered, as if someone had aimed specifically for the stars and stripes. The pilot who'd brought that aircraft home was a 51-year-old woman named Captain Iris Novick, call sign Requiem, and she'd done it after providing close air support for his SEAL team during a mission that officially never happened. Hayes had seen men twice his size freeze under fire. He'd watched seasoned operators crack when the situation turned impossible. But this woman had flown into a valley where the enemy had prepared positions on 3 ridgelines, where they'd been waiting specifically for her with weapons that could swat an A-10 from the sky like a moth, and she'd stayed on station for 47 minutes. The SEALs had lost 3 men anyway. They would have lost everyone without her. Now he stood in front of 40 pilots and officers, most of them half Novick's age, and tried to explain what he'd witnessed. The younger aviators exchanged glances. Someone in the back row smirked. Hayes knew what they were thinking because he'd thought it too before that day in the Kunar province. The Air Force kept pilots like Novick around for public relations, for diversity metrics, for the appearance of inclusion. They gave them the garbage assignments, the milk runs, the missions where nothing ever happened. They certainly didn't send them into the teeth of enemy fire when real American lives hung in the balance. Hayes had requested a different pilot for the operation. Command had told him Novick was all they had available. He'd argued. They'd overruled him. He'd gone into that valley convinced he was taking his team into a death trap because someone in a comfortable office wanted to make a political point. The briefing room's fluorescent lights hummed in the silence that followed his introduction. Outside, the desert sun hammered down on Kandahar airfield, turning the concrete into waves of shimmering heat. Somewhere on this base, Captain Novick was preparing for another mission, unaware that the man whose life she'd saved was about to tell her story to an audience that didn't want to hear it. Hayes looked down at the photograph again, at those bullet holes through the flag, and began to speak. The story actually started 6 months earlier, though Hayes wouldn't learn this until much later. Captain Iris Novick had been flying the A-10 for 23 years, longer than most of the pilots in her squadron had been alive. She'd logged over 4,000 hours in the Warthog, had flown combat missions in 3 different wars, and had a collection of air medals that she kept in a shoebox in her quarters because she'd run out of uniform space to wear them. Her call sign, Requiem, had been given to her during her first deployment to Iraq in 2003. She'd stayed on station during a firefight long after her fuel should have forced her home, providing cover for a Marine unit trapped in Nasiriyah. When she finally landed, her wingman asked how she'd kept flying on fumes. She'd replied that she wasn't leaving until the music stopped. Another pilot, a classical music enthusiast, had muttered that she'd turned the whole thing into a requiem for the enemy. The name stuck. But call signs can carry weight that their originators never intend. Over 2 decades, Requiem had become something else in Novick's mind. It was a promise to the men and women on the ground, a covenant written in jet fuel and 30 rounds. If she was overhead, someone was going home. Maybe not everyone. War didn't offer those guarantees, but someone would survive who wouldn't have otherwise. That was the deal. That was the music she kept playing, mission after mission, year after year, while younger pilots rotated through their tour and moved on to fighter jets or staff positions or civilian aviation jobs. Novick stayed with the A-10 because the A-10 stayed with the ground troops. In an Air Force increasingly obsessed with stealth and speed and standoff weapons, she'd become an anachronism, a reminder of a type of warfare the service wanted to forget. The younger pilots saw her in the ready room and made their assumptions. They saw the gray in her hair, the reading glasses she needed for the mission charts, the way she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had absorbed too many GS over too many years. They saw a relic, A pilot who'd stayed too long, who should have retired years ago to make room for fresh blood and new tactics. They didn't see the flight hours. They didn't see the missions. They saw a 51-year-old woman in a combat zone and wondered who she'd slept with or what boxes she'd checked to maintain her position. The whispers were never loud enough for her to confront directly, but they were constant enough that she heard them anyway. Novak had stopped caring about the whispers around her 40th birthday. She'd stopped caring about a lot of things that used to matter. The promotions that never came. The assignments that went to pilots with half her experience. The studied politeness from superior officers who clearly wished she'd take the hint and retire. She'd made peace with being invisible, with being tolerated rather than valued. The only thing that mattered was the mission. When she strapped into her A-10, when she ran through the pre-flight checks that she could perform in her sleep, when she pushed the throttles forward and felt 11 tons of ugly, beautiful, deadly aircraft respond to her touch, nothing else existed. Not the whispers, not the politics, not the years that had somehow accumulated like dust on everything she'd built. Just the mission, just the promise. On the morning that would change everything, Novak woke at 4:45 in her quarters at Bagram. She'd learned long ago not to look in mirrors before missions. The woman who stared back was someone she barely recognized, marked by sun and stress and the weight of promises kept. She dressed in her flight suit, the Nomex fabric soft from thousands of washings, and laced her boots with the automatic precision of ritual. Her wedding ring sat in a small box on the shelf. She'd stopped wearing it on missions years ago after the divorce. Her ex-husband had been a good man, a civilian contractor who tried to understand why she kept volunteering for deployments when she could have taken a training position stateside. He'd never grasped that for Novak, there was no separation between who she was and what she did. The A-10 wasn't her job. It was her identity. When he'd finally asked her to choose, she'd known the answer before he finished the question. The breakfast hall was nearly empty at this hour. Novak grabbed coffee and toast, ate standing up while reviewing the mission brief on her tablet. Close air support for a special operations raid in the Kunar province, target area designated as extremely hostile. Expected enemy strength was 30 to 50 fighters with small arms, RPGs, and possibly shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. The terrain was classic Afghanistan, all vertical ridgelines and hidden valleys where ambush was a certainty. It was the kind of mission that could go wrong in 100 different ways. Novak's squadron commander, a major named Pritchard who'd been in elementary school when she'd started flying, had tried to assign a younger pilot. Novak had volunteered instead. Pritchard had hesitated, then acquiesced with obvious reluctance. He probably thought he was protecting her, giving her an out. What Pritchard didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Novak didn't want protection. She wanted purpose. Every mission might be her last, not because of enemy fire but because someone in the chain of command would finally decide she was too old, too slow, too much of a liability in an age where warfare was supposed to be clean and distant and executed by pilots who looked like they belonged in recruiting posters. So she took every mission she could get, flew every sortie like it might be her final chance to keep the promise. Requiem. The music hadn't stopped yet. The walk to the flight line was something close to meditation. Dawn was breaking over the Hindu Kush, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose that seemed impossible for a place so violent. Novak had learned not to romanticize Afghanistan. It was beautiful the way a predator was beautiful, all deadly economy and pitiless function. She'd seen too many of its valleys run red, too many of its villages turn to rubble, to ever forget what waited beneath the pretty sunrise. Her A-10 sat on the hardstand, pre-flighted by crew chiefs who knew her by name. The ground crew was a mix of kids barely out of high school and seasoned sergeants who remembered when the Warthog was supposed to be retired. They gave her the kind of respect that bypassed rank, the acknowledgement that comes from shared commitment to keeping a difficult aircraft flying in the worst conditions imaginable. Staff Sergeant Kowalski, her dedicated crew chief, met her at the ladder. He was 32, had a wife and 2 daughters back in Nevada, and treated Novik's A-10 like it was a member of his family. "She's ready for you, Captain," he said, handing over the maintenance log. "Loaded for effect. 1,100 rounds of 30 Mike, 6 Mavericks, 2 pods of Hydra rockets, and full countermeasures. We topped off the fuel and checked every system twice." Novik scanned the log, her eyes catching on the little details that separated adequate maintenance from excellence. Kowalski's crew never cut corners, never took the easy path. They kept her aircraft deadlier than ships half its age. "Any squawks I should know about?" she asked. "The #2 hydraulic pressure gauge is reading a hair low, but it's within tolerance. Everything else is green." Novik nodded, signed the log, and climbed the ladder. The cockpit of an A-10 was not designed for comfort. It was a titanium bathtub surrounded by instruments and weapons systems, a workspace built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that formed the aircraft's spine. Novik settled into the ejection seat, the straps and connections as familiar as her own skin. She ran through the startup sequence, each switch and button, and dial exactly where her hands expected. The auxiliary power unit whined to life. Electrical systems came online. The attitude indicator gyroscope spun up with its characteristic whir. Outside, Kowalski gave her a thumbs up and pulled the chocks. The twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans howled as Novik advanced the throttles. She taxied toward the runway, the A-10 lurching slightly on its landing gear, ungainly on the ground in a way that always made her smile. Tower cleared her for takeoff. Novik ran the engines up to full military power, released the brakes, and felt the Warthog accelerate down the runway with its characteristic reluctance to leave the Earth. This was not an aircraft that leaped into the sky. It climbed grudgingly, trading elegance for endurance, speed for staying power. As the wheels left the concrete and Afghanistan dropped away beneath her, Novik felt the familiar transformation. On the ground, she was old, obsolete, a problem to be managed. In the air, she was what she'd always been. She was Requiem. She was death with wings and a promise. And somewhere in the mountains ahead, Americans were depending on her to keep it. The flight to the Kunar province took 45 minutes at the A-10's cruising speed of 300 knots. Novik flew at 15,000 feet, high enough to stay above most ground fire, low enough to react quickly when needed. Her wingman was Captain Marcus Webb, call sign Falcon, a 28-year-old pilot on his second deployment. Webb was talented, aggressive, and privately convinced that the Air Force was wasting resources by keeping ancient airframes and aging pilots in the rotation. He'd never said it to her face, but Novik had overheard enough conversations in the ready room to know his opinion. She didn't take it personally. He was probably right by most metrics. In a rational Air Force, she would have retired years ago. But war wasn't rational, and sometimes the old ways were old because they worked. "Mongoose 2-1, this is 2-2, Webb's voice came through the radio, professional and crisp. "I have good visual on you. Systems check is green." "Copy 2-2, Novik replied. "Maintain current altitude and spacing." The Hindu Kush spread out below them, an ocean of stone that had swallowed armies for millennia. Novik had flown over these mountains dozens of times, had provided air support in valleys whose names she couldn't pronounce for men she'd never met. Each mission blurred into the next, but she remembered specific moments with perfect clarity. The Marine who'd radioed to say her gun run had saved his entire squad. The Army Ranger who'd tracked her down in the dining facility just to shake her hand. The Air Force combat controller who'd sent her a picture of his newborn daughter with a note that read, "She's alive because you were overhead." Those moments were what kept her coming back, what made the whispers and the politics and the slow grind of time bearable. Her radio crackled with a new voice. "Mongoose flight, this is Chaos 36, requesting immediate CAS my position." The transmission was tense but controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to working under fire. This would be the SEAL team, the men she was supposed to protect today. "Chaos 36, Mongoose 2-1, Novik responded. "Send your coordinates and target description." The coordinates came through, a grid reference in a valley she'd studied in the mission brief but never flown over. As Novik punched the data into her navigation system, Chaos 3-6 continued. We have approximately 40 enemy combatants in prepared positions on 3 ridgelines. They knew we were coming. This is a trap, and we're in the bottom of it. We need danger-close fire support immediately or we're going to lose people. Novik checked her fuel, her weapons, her systems. Everything was green. She looked down at the mountains, at the valley where men were dying, and pushed the stick forward. The descent was controlled but rapid, though responding to her inputs with the solid reliability that had made it legendary. Webb stayed high, maintaining overwatch position as briefed. As Novik dropped below 10,000 feet, she started to see muzzle flashes on the ridgelines, little sparks of light that marked the enemy positions. The valley itself was narrow, maybe 300 meters wide at the bottom, with steep slopes on either side. Tactically, it was a nightmare. Anyone on the valley floor was exposed to fire from multiple directions with limited cover and no easy exit. The SEALs had been baited into a killing zone, and they knew it. The only question was whether Novik could do anything about it before they were overrun. Chaos 3-6, Mongoose 2-1 is 3 minutes out, she transmitted. I need you to mark your position and give me firing solutions on those ridgelines. Copy 2-1, the SEAL replied. Marking with infrared strobe now. Priority targets are on the northern ridgeline, approximately 75 meters from our position. They have heavy machine guns and RPGs. We've already taken casualties. Novik's helmet-mounted display showed the infrared strobe blooming in her vision as she descended through 5,000 feet. The SEALs were clustered in a dried streambed that provided minimal cover. The northern ridgeline was exactly where the SEAL said it was, and Novik could see figures moving among the rocks. 75 meters. Danger close didn't begin to describe it. If she was off by even a few degrees, she'd kill the people she was trying to save. The A-10 had been built for this kind of precision, but it required a pilot willing to get low, slow, and vulnerable. Novik had been doing exactly that for 23 years. She armed the GAU-8, the targeting pipper on her heads-up display dancing across the ridgeline as she refined her approach. The Avenger cannon was the most distinctive weapon in the Air Force inventory, a 7-barrel rotary gun that fired 30 depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second. When it fired, it made a sound like tearing canvas, a BRRRRRT that could be heard for miles. More importantly, it could shred armored vehicles, fortified positions, and enemy combatants with equal efficiency. Novik had fired the gun so many times that she'd internalized its ballistics, knew instinctively how to compensate for wind, altitude, and aircraft attitude. As she rolled into her attack run, a detached part of her mind noted that she was violating at least 3 safety protocols. She was too low, too slow, and too close to friendly forces. If this went wrong, they'd probably court-martial her posthumously. The shot was perfect. Novik squeezed the trigger and felt the aircraft shudder as the Avenger spun up. A stream of 30 rounds poured into the northern ridgeline, walking through the enemy positions like the hand of God. Dust and rock fragments erupted into the air. Through her canopy, Novik saw bodies tumbling down the slope. The muzzle flashes stopped. She pulled up hard, trading airspeed for altitude, her eyes scanning for threats. The radio erupted with chatter. Holy shit, Mongoose, that was on the money. Chaos 3-6 sounded breathless. You just took out their primary position, but we've still got heavy fire from the eastern and southern ridges. Novik was already banking around for another pass, her mind calculating angles and fuel consumption. This was going to take more than one gun run. This was going to take everything she had. For the next 47 minutes, Captain Iris Novik turned the valley into a demonstration of what close air support was supposed to look like. She made 6 separate gun runs on the eastern ridgeline, each one threading between the constraints of terrain and friendly positions with surgical precision. She dropped 2 Maverick missiles on a mortar position that was bracketing the SEAL team with alarming accuracy. She fired Hydra rockets into a cave entrance where enemy fighters were repositioning for a final assault. Between attacks, she orbited the valley at 3,000 feet, low enough that small arms fire sparked off her titanium bathtub. high enough that she maintained the visibility needed to coordinate with the ground team. Webb, watching from above, transmitted repeatedly that she needed to gain altitude, that she was taking too much fire, that she should break off and let him take over. Novik ignored him. The music hadn't stopped yet. The enemy positions were well prepared and well armed. Novik registered the tactical sophistication even as she prosecuted target after target. These weren't random insurgents with AK-47s. They had interlocking fields of fire, designated marksmen and crew-served weapons positioned for maximum effectiveness. Someone had trained them, equipped them, and given them intelligence about the SEAL operation. As Novik rolled in on her 7th gun run, she saw the telltale smoke trail of a surface-to-air missile launching from the southern ridgeline. "Mongoose 2-1, SAM launch," Webb shouted over the radio. Novik was already reacting, punching countermeasures and braking hard left. Flares bloomed behind her aircraft, hot magnesium burning bright enough to decoy the missile seeker. The SAM tracked the flares instead of her engines and detonated harmlessly 300 meters away. But the message was clear. They'd brought heavy weapons to this fight. They'd planned to kill aircraft as well as ground forces. Any rational pilot would have broken off at that point. The mission parameters had changed. The enemy had capabilities that hadn't been briefed. Standard doctrine said to pull back, reassess, and request additional support. Novik could hear Webb on the radio, arguing exactly that to the AWACS controller orbiting somewhere over Pakistan. But Novik could also hear Chaos 3-6 on the emergency channel, his voice still controlled but tighter now, saying they'd taken 2 more casualties and were running low on ammunition. The SEALs needed her to stay. Standard doctrine didn't account for the promise she'd made to herself 2 decades ago. Requiem meant you stayed until the music stopped. It meant the mission came first always, even when continuing meant accepting risks that no safety board would ever approve. Novik keyed her transmit button. Chaos 3-6, Mongoose 2-1 is still in the fight. Mark that SAM position for me. The SEAL's response came back immediately. Coordinates and description delivered with the clipped efficiency of someone who understood that time was a commodity they couldn't afford to waste. Novik fed the information into her weapons system and began her approach on the southern ridgeline. The SAM site was dug into the slope, camouflaged well enough that she had to strain to pick it out even with her targeting pod's magnification. As she descended through 4,000 feet, her missile warning receiver lit up. Another SAM launch, this time tracking perfectly. No time for countermeasures, no time for evasive maneuvers. Novik did the only thing she could do. She completed her attack run, put a Maverick missile directly into the SAM site, and felt the impact of the second missile hitting her aircraft at the same moment her weapon struck home. The explosion was deafening even through the cockpit's sound insulation. The A-10 pitched violently to the right. Emergency warnings flooded her helmet display. Hydraulic failure in the left system. Fire warning in the right engine. Multiple control surfaces damaged or unresponsive. The aircraft that had been responding smoothly to her inputs suddenly felt like wrestling a wounded animal. Novik shut down the right engine, activated the fire suppression system, and fought to regain controlled flight. The A-10's redundant systems were doing their job, keeping her airborne when most aircraft would have been spinning toward the ground. But she was losing altitude, losing airspeed, and losing the ability to maneuver. Webb's voice cut through the chaos, urgent now. 2-1, you need to eject. You're on fire and losing control. Novik checked her instruments, ran through the emergency procedures she'd practiced 1,000 times. The fire warning light had gone out. The hydraulic systems were degraded but functional. She still had some control authority. More importantly, she still had 500 rounds of 30mm ammunition and 1 working engine. -2-2, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the sweat running down her face. I still have combat capability. Chaos 3-6, what's your situation? The SEAL team leader's response was drowned out by the distinctive sound of heavy machine gun fire in the background. We're pinned down by 2 positions on the western slope. If we don't move in the next 5 minutes, we're not moving at all. Novik looked at her fuel gauge, her altimeter, her engine temperature readings. Every indicator told her the same thing. She should be heading back to base right now, nursing her damaged aircraft toward safety while she still had the chance. Instead, she banked toward the western slope, lined up on the coordinates the SEAL had provided, and began her final gun run. The A-10 responded sluggishly, the damaged control surfaces forcing her to make constant tiny corrections. But the targeting pipper settled on the enemy position. Novik squeezed the trigger one more time. The remaining ammunition in the Avenger cycled through in less than 10 seconds, a continuous burst that excavated the western slope like an industrial mining operation. When the gun fell silent, the enemy position was simply gone, replaced by a smoking crater and scattered debris. Novik pulled up, or tried to. The aircraft was barely responding now, wallowing through the air more than flying. Her altitude was down to 1,500 feet, her airspeed bleeding away toward stall speed. The remaining engine was running hot, probably damaged by fragments from the missile that had hit her. She had maybe 10 minutes before something catastrophic failed. Chaos 36 came back on the radio, and this time she could hear the emotion breaking through his professional control. Mongoose 2-1, that's all targets neutralized. You've cleared the valley. We can move now. Get yourself out of here. We've got it from here. Novik pointed the nose of her aircraft toward Bagram and began the longest flight of her life. The A-10 limped through the sky at 200 knots, altitude gradually decreasing despite her best efforts. Webb formed up on her wing, calling out her status for the benefit of the emergency crews at base. Every minute she stayed airborne felt like borrowed time. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, metal grinding against metal somewhere in the damaged control systems. Novik's hands were locked on the stick and throttle, making constant minute adjustments to keep the Warthog from rolling into an uncontrolled descent. She'd stopped thinking about anything except the next moment, the next input, the next breath. Flying had become a physical argument with gravity and physics, a negotiation conducted through damaged hydraulics and sheer determination. The mountains passed beneath her with agonizing slowness. Bagram was 45 minutes away. She wasn't sure she had 45 minutes. At 15 minutes out, her remaining engine started to overheat critically. The temperature gauge crept into the red zone, and Novik could smell burning oil through the cockpit's ventilation system. She throttled back, trading airspeed for temperature margin, and felt the A-10 settle lower in the sky. Now she was at 8,000 feet, now 7,000, the ground rising to meet her as she coaxed the dying aircraft toward home. Webb stayed on her wing, calling out altitudes, offering encouragement, his earlier skepticism forgotten in the shared understanding of what she was attempting. Every pilot knew that getting a damaged aircraft home was part skill and part luck. Novik had the skill. Whether she had the luck remained to be seen. At 10 minutes out, she contacted Bagram Tower. They'd already been briefed. The runway was cleared, emergency equipment was standing by, and the entire base seemed to be holding its breath. The landing was more controlled crash than flight. Novik had no hydraulic pressure left for the landing gear, so she extended it manually, unsure if all three wheels would lock. Her airspeed was barely above stall, and she had no margin for error. The approach was a constant battle against the aircraft's desire to roll right, every second bringing her closer to the moment when control inputs would no longer be sufficient. She crossed the threshold at the lowest speed she'd ever attempted, the stall warning horn blaring, the shaking like it was coming apart. The wheels touched down hard. Something in the landing gear collapsed, sending the aircraft lurching sickeningly to one side. Novik fought it, holding what little control she had, keeping the bird on the runway as it ground and sparked its way to a stop. When the aircraft finally shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from multiple systems, she sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands still locked on the controls. The rescue crews surrounded her aircraft before she could climb out. Medical personnel insisted on checking her for injuries she didn't have. Maintenance crews stared at the damage in disbelief. Kowalski, her crew chief, looked at the shredded engine, the gouged control surfaces, The holes punched through areas that should have been catastrophically vulnerable, and just shook his head. "Captain," he said quietly, "I don't know how you flew this home." Novik looked at her aircraft, at the machine that had taken everything the enemy could throw at it and kept flying anyway, and felt something inside her chest crack. She'd kept the promise. She'd stayed on station. She'd brought the SEALs home, and she'd brought herself home, and now the music could finally stop. She turned away before anyone could see her face and walked toward the debriefing that she knew would be difficult, because someone would have to explain why she'd violated safety protocols and taken unnecessary risks and stayed in the fight long after doctrine said she should have withdrawn. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Novik sat in a conference room while intelligence officers and senior leadership asked questions about the mission, the enemy capabilities, the engagement sequence. Major Pritchard, her squadron commander, asked pointed questions about her decision-making process, his tone carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was building a case for administrative action. Novik answered everything factually, without embellishment or excuse. Yes, she'd been aware of the safety implications. Yes, she'd understood the risks of continuing to provide support after the SAM launch. Yes, she'd made a conscious decision to prioritize the ground force's survival over her own safety margins. Pritchard took notes, his expression growing more concerned with each answer. When the debriefing finally ended, he asked her to stay behind. The room emptied, leaving just the two of them and the weight of what he was about to say. "Captain Novik," Pritchard began, and the formality of the address told her everything she needed to know. "I'm going to be honest with you. What you did today is going to generate paperwork. There are going to be questions from people well above my pay grade about whether you exercised appropriate judgment out there. The AAR is going to show that you violated multiple safety protocols, continued an engagement after your aircraft took battle damage, and executed danger-close fire support runs that were well outside the acceptable risk parameters. I can't protect you from that. But I also can't ignore the fact that you saved the lives of 12 Navy SEALs who would otherwise be dead right now. So I don't know what happens next. I genuinely don't know if they're going to pin a medal on you or ground you permanently. Maybe both." Novik looked at her squadron commander and saw a man struggling with competing responsibilities. Pritchard was a good officer, someone who cared about his people and tried to do right by them. But he was also institutional, someone who believed in the system and its rules even when those rules produced uncomfortable results. She didn't blame him for that. Someone had to maintain order, had to enforce the standards that kept the Air Force functioning. If every pilot made their own rules, made their own decisions about acceptable risk, the result would be chaos. Novik understood that. She also understood that her time was probably up, that today's mission had been both her finest moment and her last hurrah. "Major," she said quietly, "I'm not going to apologize for what I did. I'm not going to say I'd do it differently. Those men needed me to stay, so I stayed. That's the job. That's always been the job." Pritchard nodded slowly as if he'd expected that answer. "I know, Captain, I know." He stood, gathered his papers, and paused at the door. "For what it's worth, what you did today was the kind of flying that built this service's reputation. Whatever happens next, you should know that." He left. Novik sat alone in the conference room, staring at the blank walls and wondering what came after you'd given everything to a promise that no one had asked you to make. Outside, the sun was setting over Bagram, another day ending in Afghanistan, another night beginning with all its dangers and darkness. Somewhere on this base, 12 SEALs were alive who shouldn't be. Somewhere in the future, a board of officers would decide if what she'd done was heroism or recklessness. Novik found she didn't much care which conclusion they reached. She'd kept the promise. That was enough. The next morning, Novik was summoned to the base commander's office. Colonel Anderson was a career officer who'd flown F-16s in Desert Storm and commanded 3 different fighter squadrons over a 30-year career. He was not someone who indulged in small talk or unnecessary meetings. When Novik entered his office, she found Lieutenant Commander Hayes waiting with him, still in his combat fatigues, looking like he hadn't slept. Anderson gestured for her to sit. "Captain Novak," the colonel began, "Commander Hayes has some things he wants to tell you. Actually, he insisted on telling you. So I'm going to let him do that, and then we're going to have a conversation about your future." Hayes looked at Novak with an intensity that was uncomfortable. "Captain, I need you to understand something. When I found out you were assigned to provide our air support, I protested. I requested a different pilot. I thought Command was sending us someone who'd gotten the assignment as a diversity checkbox, someone who wouldn't be able to handle a real fight. I was wrong in ways I'm still processing." Hayes stood, began packing, the words coming faster as he tried to articulate something he was clearly struggling to express. "What you did yesterday, what I watched you do for almost an hour, was the most skilled combat flying I've ever witnessed. And I've worked with the best pilots in the Navy, with Air Force combat veterans, with people who have thousands of hours in fighters and bombers. None of them could have done what you did. The precision required to put fire that close to our position without killing us. The situational awareness needed to prosecute multiple targets while taking fire yourself. The sheer physical ability to control a damaged aircraft while still delivering effective weapons. It's beyond anything I've seen. My team is alive because you're better at your job than anyone has any right to be. And I need you to know that, because from what I'm hearing, there are people who want to ground you for taking risks yesterday." Novak listened without expression, her face carefully neutral. Praise was dangerous. It made you hope for things that wouldn't happen, made you think that competence might finally be enough. Colonel Anderson cleared his throat. "Commander Hayes has filed an after-action report that's going to make its way up both our chains of command. He's also personally recommended you for the Air Force Cross. I've endorsed that recommendation for whatever that's worth. But Captain, we need to address the elephant in the room. You flew a damaged aircraft for over 30 minutes when doctrine clearly states you should have ejected or withdrawn immediately. You conducted multiple attack runs at altitudes and speeds that violate every safety protocol we have. You ignored your wingman's repeated calls to break off. By the letter of the regulations, what you did was insubordination and reckless endangerment. Now, I don't personally believe that, and Commander Hayes clearly doesn't believe it. But there are flag officers at the Pentagon who will see your actions as exactly the kind of cowboy behavior we've been trying to eliminate from the combat aviation culture." The choice was hers, Anderson explained. She could accept a medical retirement based on the physical stress of yesterday's mission and her age. It would be honorable, even decorated. They'd make sure she got every medal and commendation she'd earned. She'd go out on top, with her reputation intact and the gratitude of everyone who understood what she'd done. The alternative was to stay, to face the investigation and the scrutiny and the possibility that a review board might end her career on less favorable terms. Anderson made it clear which option he thought she should choose. He was trying to protect her, to give her a graceful exit before the institutional machinery turned against her. Novak understood that. She also understood that accepting the medical retirement would be a lie, a way for the Air Force to move her out while saving face on all sides. She wasn't injured, she wasn't incapable, she was just inconvenient. "Sir," Novak said, addressing Anderson but aware that Hayes was listening to every word, "I appreciate everything you're trying to do, but I'm not retiring. If they want to investigate me, they can investigate. If they want to ground me, they'll have to ground me formally, with findings and conclusions and all the paperwork that entails. I'm not making it easy by walking away. I've given this service 23 years. I've flown every mission they've asked me to fly, met every standard they've set, and yesterday I saved 12 lives while getting shot to pieces. I'm not going to apologize for that or hide from the consequences of doing my job correctly. If that makes things difficult, I'm sorry, but I'm not leaving unless they force me out." Anderson and Hayes exchanged a glance. Something passed between them, some understanding that Novak wasn't privy to. Colonel Anderson leaned back in his chair, a thin smile crossing his face. "I told Commander Hayes you'd say exactly that. He bet me $50 that you'd take the retirement." Hayes had the grace to look embarrassed. I'm learning not to make assumptions about you, Captain. Anderson's smile faded. All right, Novak, you want to stay in the fight, we'll keep you in the fight. But understand that the next few months are going to be uncomfortable. There will be an investigation. There will be questions. There will be people who want to make an example out of you and people who want to turn you into a propaganda symbol, and neither of those groups cares what you actually want. You're going to have to navigate that. Can you do that? Novak thought about the whispers she'd endured for years, the studied invisibility she'd maintained, the careful neutrality she'd cultivated. Yes, sir, she said. I can do that. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. During that time, Novak was grounded, assigned to administrative duties while a team of Air Force legal officers and safety board members reviewed every aspect of the Kunar province mission. They interviewed her repeatedly, asking the same questions in different ways, probing for inconsistencies or admissions of poor judgment. They interviewed Webb, Pritchard, the SEAL team, the AWACS controllers, even the maintenance crews who'd assessed her damaged aircraft. The process was designed to be thorough and impartial. It felt like a trial. Novak went through the motions, answered the questions, and waited. The hardest part wasn't the investigation itself, but the forced inactivity. Every day grounded was a day she wasn't flying, wasn't keeping the promise. She watched younger pilots take missions she should have flown and tried not to feel like she was abandoning the people on the ground who needed her. The squadron moved on without her. Life continued. Only Novak felt frozen in place, waiting for a verdict that would determine whether she still had purpose. The SEAL team didn't wait for the official investigation to conclude. 1 week after the mission, the 12 men she'd kept alive showed up at Bagram unannounced. They found Novak in the Squadron Operations Center, staring at mission reports she wasn't allowed to fly. Commander Hayes spoke for the group. Captain, we don't know how your investigation is going to turn out. We don't know if the Air Force is going to recognize what you did for us. But we know. Every single one of us knows that we should be dead, and we're not dead because you refused to leave us. So we wanted to give you this before some board of officers decides whether you followed the correct procedures. He handed her a wooden plaque. It was simple, made by someone without professional woodworking skills, probably carved in someone's quarters using borrowed tools. The inscription read, "To Requiem, who played the music when hell was the audience, from the men who got to go home." Beneath that were 12 signatures. Novak looked at the plaque and felt the careful control she'd maintained for 6 weeks begin to fracture. These were Navy SEALs, men whose entire identity was built around stoicism and emotional control. They didn't make grand gestures or sentimental speeches. The fact that they were here at all, the fact that they'd made this plaque and tracked her down to give it to her, said more than any words could express. She tried to thank them, found she couldn't speak, and settled for a nod that she hoped conveyed what she couldn't articulate. Hayes understood. "We're going to testify at your hearing if they let us. We're going to tell them exactly what happened and why you made the decisions you made. Maybe it won't matter, maybe they've already decided, but we're going to try." The SEALs left. Novak stayed in the operations center, holding the plaque, reading the signatures over and over. 12 names, 12 lives. The promise kept. The investigation concluded in Novak's favor, but barely. The safety board found that, while her actions had violated multiple protocols, they were justified by the tactical situation and the successful outcome. The legal review determined that she had not been insubordinate because her squadron commander had not actually ordered her to withdraw. The final report praised her flying skills and her commitment to the ground forces, while recommending additional training on risk management for all pilots. It was the kind of bureaucratic compromise that left everyone slightly dissatisfied. Novak was cleared to return to flying status, but with a formal letter of counseling in her file noting the safety violations. She would not face court-martial or administrative separation. She also would not receive the Air Force Cross that Commander Hayes had recommended. The medal required unanimous support from the review chain, and at least one general officer had objected, arguing that decorating her would send the wrong message about acceptable risk-taking. Novak received the news in Colonel Anderson's office. He handed her the final report and watched her read through it with an expression somewhere between satisfaction and frustration. "You're not happy with this outcome," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Sir, I didn't do what I did for medals," Novick replied. "But the Air Force just spent 6 weeks investigating whether saving 12 lives was worth the risk I took. The answer they came up with is maybe, but please don't do it again." That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of close air support doctrine. Anderson sighed. "Captain, you're not wrong, but you're also not seeing the bigger picture. The fact that you're still flying, that you're not being forced into retirement or reassigned to a desk job in the continental United States, is actually a significant victory. There were people at the Pentagon who wanted your career over. The fact that you're still here means that the people who matter understood what you did and why you did it." Novick returned to flight status on a Tuesday morning. She went through the standard readiness checks, reviewed the current tactical situation, and was assigned to a standard patrol mission that everyone understood was designed to ease her back into operations gently. Nothing dangerous, nothing controversial, just flight hours and routine overwatch. Novick accepted the assignment without comment and briefed with her flight as if the past 6 weeks hadn't happened. But something had shifted. The younger pilots who'd barely acknowledged her before now watched her differently. The whispers had changed tone. When she walked into the ready room, conversations didn't stop, but they did pause, as if people were reconsidering their earlier assessments. Novick found it unsettling. She'd made peace with being invisible. Being visible was harder in ways she hadn't anticipated. She preferred the anonymity of being underestimated. Recognition came with expectations she wasn't sure she wanted to meet. The mission was uneventful until it wasn't. Novick was 3 hours into a routine patrol over Helmand Province when the radio crackled with an emergency call. An Army patrol had been ambushed in a river valley 20 kilometers south of her position. They were pinned down, taking casualties, and the nearest Apache helicopters were 30 minutes out. Could anyone provide immediate support? Novick checked her fuel, her weapons load, her position. She had enough of everything except time. She looked at her wingman, a pilot named Davies who transferred into the squadron while she was grounded. "Mongoose 2-2, did you catch that traffic?" Davies responded immediately. "Affirm 2-1, I'm with you." They banked south together, 2 A-10s accelerating to combat speed, leaving the safety of routine patrol behind. As they closed on the river valley, Novick ran through the mental calculus she performed hundreds of times before. Threat assessment, friendly positions, weapon selection, approach angles. But this time another variable had entered the equation: the investigation, the scrutiny, the knowledge that someone would review every decision she made. For a moment doubt flickered. Then she heard the Army patrol leader on the radio, calling for help in a voice that was all control and desperation, and the doubt vanished. The mission came first. It always had. It always would. The engagement was textbook by A-10 standards, which meant it was terrifying by any other measure. Novick rolled in on the ambush position at 4,000 feet, her targeting pods showing 15 to 20 enemy fighters in tree-line positions overlooking the river valley. The Army patrol was trapped against the riverbank with no cover and no room to maneuver. Novick designated targets for Davies, split the engagement zone, and began her attack run. The GAU-8 spoke its stuttering language of violence, and the tree line erupted in explosions and smoke. She pulled up, came around for a second pass, saw Davies' rockets walk through another cluster of enemy positions. The fight lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the Army patrol reported all threats neutralized and requested permission to begin casualty evacuation. 0 KIA, 3 wounded, all because 2 A-10 pilots had been overhead with weapons and the willingness to use them. Standard mission, routine outcome, exactly the kind of work that made the Warthog irreplaceable despite decades of efforts to retire it. Back at Bagram, Novick filed her after-action report with the same detailed precision she'd used for 23 years. No embellishment, no drama, just facts and results. Major Pritchard read through it, signed off without comment, and added it to the squadron's daily summary. The mission had generated no paperwork beyond the standard forms, no investigations, no questions from higher headquarters. It was, in the grand scheme of things, completely unremarkable. Novik should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt oddly let down, as if she'd been preparing for a fight that never materialized. Maybe that was the real legacy of the Kunar province mission. Not the investigation or the scrutiny, but the realization that what she'd done that day was simply a more dramatic version of what she did every day. Flying into danger, staying on station, keeping the promise. The only difference was that this time people had been watching. This time, the music had been loud enough that no one could pretend not to hear it. The weeks turned into months. Novik flew missions, came home, flew more missions. The deployment cycle continued with its grinding inevitability. Spring turned to summer in Afghanistan, which meant the heat became unbearable and the dust turned everything the same brown-gray color. Pilots rotated home, new pilots rotated in, the squadron's roster churning through the usual personnel changes. Through it all, Novik remained, a fixed point in the rotation, the pilot who never left. She'd become an institution without meaning to, the squadron's longest-serving member, the keeper of knowledge that couldn't be written down. The newer pilots started asking her questions, not about regulations or procedures, but about the real things, the things that mattered in combat. How do you judge distance when attacking a ridgeline? How do you stay calm when the missile warning receiver starts screaming? How do you live with the missions that don't end well? Novik answered honestly without pretense or false comfort. Sometimes you guess wrong. Sometimes you panic inside but control it. Sometimes you don't live with it. You just survive it and move forward. 6 months after the Kunar province mission, Major Pritchard was promoted to lieutenant colonel and rotated back to the States for a staff position. His replacement was a lieutenant colonel named Sarah Vance, a former F-22 pilot who transitioned to command after being selected for the leadership track. Vance was everything Novik wasn't: young, political, comfortable in the world of PowerPoint presentations and strategic planning. She arrived at Bagram with a reputation for efficiency and a mandate to modernize the squadron's operations. Her first meeting with Novik was professional and slightly distant. She reviewed Novik's file, noted her age and time in service, and asked pointed questions about her retirement plans. Novik gave vague answers about wanting to finish the deployment. Vance didn't push, but the message was clear. The new squadron commander saw Novik as a transitional asset, someone to be managed out gracefully rather than built around. It was a familiar dynamic. Novik had been managed out gracefully for years. She knew how to navigate it. What Vance didn't understand, what none of the career officers seemed to understand, was that Novik wasn't staying for the career progression or the retirement benefits. She was staying for the missions, for the increasingly rare opportunities to keep the promise. Every time someone suggested she should retire, should take a training position, should move into a role more appropriate for her age and experience, they were really saying she should stop doing the only thing that gave her life meaning. Novik couldn't explain that without sounding obsessive or unhealthy, so she didn't try. She just kept flying, kept volunteering for the difficult missions, kept being exactly what the A-10 community needed even as the broader Air Force tried to figure out what to do with both her and her aircraft. The Warthog was supposed to be retired. She was supposed to be retired. The fact that both were still essential was an inconvenience to people trying to plan for a different kind of Air Force. Then Commander Hayes came back. He arrived at Bagram unannounced on a Tuesday morning, tracked Novik down in the Squadron Operations Center, and asked if they could talk privately. They found an empty briefing room. Hayes looked uncomfortable, like he was about to ask for something he knew was unreasonable. "Captain, I need to tell you about something that's been happening back in the States. After the Kunar province mission, after my team and I were debriefed, I started telling people your story. Not officially, just in conversations with other SEAL operators, with Marine recon guys, with people who do the kind of work that depends on close air support. And something happened. Every single person I talked to had a story about an A-10 pilot who'd saved their lives. Usually it was a different pilot, a different mission, a different deployment. But the pattern was the same. Ground force in trouble. A-10 overhead, impossible situation resolved through some combination of skill and stubbornness. It turns out the warthog community has been quietly keeping people alive for decades, while the Air Force tries to figure out how to get rid of them. Hayes pulled out his phone, showed Novik a video that had been uploaded to YouTube 3 days earlier. It was titled, "The Pilots Who Won't Leave You Behind," and it had already been viewed over 2 million times. The video was a compilation of testimonials from ground force members, all telling their A-10 stories. There was a Marine sergeant who'd been pulled out of a Taliban ambush in 2009, an Army Ranger who'd survived a mass casualty event in 2014 because an A-10 pilot had stayed overhead for 2 hours past her fuel reserve, a British SAS operator who credited his survival to an American pilot he'd never met but whose call sign he'd never forgotten. The video was raw and emotional in a way that military personnel rarely allowed themselves to be public, and it was clearly resonating. People were sharing it, commenting on it, using it to argue for keeping the A-10 in service despite the Air Force's repeated attempts to retire the platform. Captain Hayes continued, "Your story is in that video. I told them what you did, what I watched you do, and they featured it prominently. I didn't ask your permission, and I probably should have. But I thought you should know that people are talking about you, not just military people, civilians, legislators, media outlets." The video's gone viral, and now there's a whole conversation happening about close air support and the value of keeping older platforms that were specifically designed for ground support missions. I don't know if it's going to change anything. The Air Force makes its decisions based on factors way above our level. But I wanted you to know that the people who understand what you do, the people whose lives depend on pilots like you, they're trying to make sure their voices are heard. Novik watched the video, saw her own call sign appear on the screen alongside dozens of others, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, but recognition. The music she'd been playing had been heard after all. The video's impact was immediate and significant. Within a week, Novik's squadron commander called her into the office. Lieutenant Colonel Vance looked like someone who'd been dealing with unexpected complications all morning. "Captain Novik, I've received inquiries from Air Combat Command, from the Pentagon Public Affairs Office, and from 3 different congressional offices all asking about you. It seems you've become the face of a very public debate about the future of close air support. I need to know if you were involved in creating that video or coordinating with Commander Hayes on his media efforts." Novik shook her head. "Ma'am, I found out about the video 3 days ago. I didn't authorize it, didn't contribute to it, and didn't know it was being made." Vance studied her, clearly trying to determine if that was the whole truth. "All right, I believe you, but here's your situation now. You're not invisible anymore. You're a symbol whether you wanted to be or not. The Pentagon wants to feature you in recruitment materials. Congress wants you to testify about the value of the A-10 program. The media wants interviews. And I need to figure out how to manage all of this while still running a combat squadron. So I'm going to ask you directly, what do you want?" It was the first time in years anyone had asked Novik what she wanted. She thought about the right answer, the politically savvy response that would navigate the competing interests and preserve her ability to keep flying. Then she thought about the promise, about 23 years of keeping faith with people on the ground who needed her to be overhead. "Ma'am, I want to fly missions. I don't want to be a symbol or a recruitment tool or a congressional witness. I want to strap into my A-10 and provide close air support for ground forces who need it. Everything else is distraction." Vance leaned back in her chair, something like respect crossing her face. "I figured you'd say that. Unfortunately, the decision isn't entirely mine anymore. The Air Force has priorities that go beyond individual preferences, but I'll do what I can to minimize the disruption. No promises beyond that." The Air Force's solution was to split the difference in a way that satisfied no one completely. Novik would remain on flying status and continue to take missions. However, she would also participate in a limited number of media engagements and briefings designed to showcase the A-10's capabilities and the skill of its pilots. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office would coordinate everything, ensuring that Novik's story was told in a way that supported the service's broader messaging goals. It was a compromise that treated Novik's preference for anonymity and the institution's need for positive publicity as equally valid considerations. Novik hated every aspect of it except the part where she kept flying. She endured the interviews, the photo shoots, the carefully staged briefings where she explained close air support tactics to people who would never fly a combat mission. She smiled when required, answered questions with practiced neutrality, and counted the hours until she could return to work that mattered. The media attention had an unexpected side effect. Suddenly, Novik's age and experience were assets rather than liabilities. Reporters loved the narrative of the veteran pilot who'd outlasted her critics, the woman who'd proven herself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The Pentagon loved having a counterexample to critics who said the military wasn't using its personnel effectively. Congressional supporters of the A-10 program loved having a living embodiment of the aircraft's value. Everyone found something useful in Captain Iris Novik's story. Novik herself found the whole thing deeply uncomfortable. She wasn't a hero. She was a pilot who'd done her job competently under difficult circumstances. The fact that this was noteworthy said more about others' expectations than her performance. But arguing the point would have been ungracious and politically naive. So she accepted the attention with as much grace as she could manufacture and tried not to let it change how she approached the actual work. The younger pilots in the squadron reacted to Novik's sudden visibility with a mixture of pride and resentment. Some were genuinely pleased to see one of their own recognized, to have proof that their unglamorous, mud-and-blood mission set mattered to someone. Others felt that the attention was excessive, that Novik had simply done what any competent pilot would have done in the same situation. A few started training harder, studying more intently, as if they wanted to prove they could match her performance if given the chance. Novik watched these dynamics unfold with mild interest but no personal investment. The squadron would find its equilibrium. Her job wasn't to manage personalities or resolve conflicts. Her job was to fly the A-10 and keep the promise. Everything else was background noise that she'd learned to tune out over 2 decades of service. 8 months after the Kunar province mission, Novik was on patrol over Kandahar province when her radio crackled with an emergency call from a Marine Corps unit under heavy attack. The circumstances were grimly familiar. Ground force in an exposed position, enemy on the high ground, casualties mounting, immediate air support required. Novik responded automatically, her hands moving through the procedures she'd performed so many times they'd become muscle memory. But as she rolled in on her first gun run, she realized something had changed. She was afraid, not of dying, not of the enemy fire that sparked off her aircraft's armor. She was afraid of surviving, of returning to base and triggering another cycle of attention and scrutiny and forced visibility. The mission that should have been pure, that should have been only about keeping the promise, was now complicated by the knowledge that people were watching, that her actions would be analyzed and discussed, and probably turned into another piece of the ongoing debate about her aircraft and her place in the Air Force. The fear lasted about 3 seconds. Then training and commitment took over, and Novik stopped thinking about anything except the Marines on the ground and the enemy positions that needed to be destroyed. She made 6 gun runs, expended all her Maverick missiles, and stayed on station until Apache helicopters arrived to take over. The engagement was successful by every metric. 0 friendly KIA, all enemy positions neutralized. Mission accomplished. It should have been another routine success, another day's work in a long career of similar missions. Instead, it became further evidence for the people who wanted to prove something about the A-10's value or Novik's competence, or the importance of keeping experienced pilots in combat roles. The mission report was circulated to senior leadership. The video of her gun runs was used in a briefing at the Pentagon. Her squadron commander used the engagement as a training example. Novik endured it all and wondered when she'd be allowed to return to anonymity. The answer, it turned out, was never. Once visibility is achieved, it cannot be easily discarded. Novik had become a permanent fixture in the Air Force's public narrative about close air support, about the value of experience, about the capabilities that made the A-10 irreplaceable. She appeared in recruiting materials. Her call sign was referenced in articles about military aviation. Young pilots who'd never met her knew her story, knew about the damaged A-10 she'd brought home with bullet holes through the flag. Novik found herself representing something larger than her own service, embodying an argument about military doctrine and resource allocation that she'd never particularly wanted to engage with. She was 52 years old, had been flying combat missions for 23 years, and had somehow become famous for doing exactly what she'd always done. It was absurd. It was unwelcome. It was, apparently, irreversible. Lieutenant Colonel Vance called her into the office on a Friday afternoon. "Captain, I've received notification from Air Combat Command. They're giving you a choice. You can accept a promotion to major and a transfer to a training position at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, where you'll be responsible for instructing new A-10 pilots. Or you can maintain your current rank and position here, continuing to fly combat missions until you reach mandatory retirement age in 3 years. Both options come with command's full support. They want you to know that whatever you choose, your service has been exemplary and your contributions recognized." It was a trap disguised as a choice. Accept the promotion and leave combat flying forever, or reject advancement to stay in a position that the Air Force's personnel system wasn't really designed to accommodate. Vance clearly expected her to take the promotion. It was the smart career move, the path that led to comfortable retirement and institutional respect. Novik thought about 3 more years. She thought about the missions she hadn't flown yet, the promises she hadn't kept, the people on the ground who might need her overhead. She thought about training new pilots at Davis-Monthan, passing on her knowledge to the next generation, contributing to the A-10 community's long-term sustainability. Both options had merit. Both served the larger mission in different ways. But only one let her keep flying, keep taking the sorties that no one else particularly wanted, keep being Requiem. "Ma'am," she said slowly, "I appreciate the promotion opportunity, but I'm going to stay here. I'm going to keep flying." Vance didn't look surprised. "I figured you'd say that. For what it's worth, I think you're making a mistake. You could do a lot of good training the next generation. You'd be comfortable, safe, and still contributing meaningfully to the mission. Instead, you're choosing to stay in a combat zone at an age when most pilots have long since moved on. But it's your choice, and I'll support it." 3 more years. Novik flew missions, came home, flew more missions. The seasons changed in Afghanistan with their subtle variations on brown and tan and gray. The war continued its long grind toward an eventual conclusion that no one really believed would be final. The Taliban attacked. Coalition forces responded. Villages were fought over and retaken and lost again. The strategic situation shifted in ways that mattered to generals and policymakers, but not particularly to the pilots who provided close air support regardless of the broader context. Novik turned 53, then 54. Her reflexes slowed incrementally. Her eyes required stronger reading glasses for the mission charts. Her body ached after long sorties in ways it hadn't when she was younger. She compensated with experience, with judgment, with the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades in the cockpit. The A-10 aged alongside her, its airframe hours climbing toward limits that would eventually require expensive service life extension programs or retirement. Then, on a mission that started as routine patrol, Novik's aircraft developed a hydraulic leak that rapidly progressed to complete system failure. She was over the mountains, 40 minutes from base, when the stick went dead in her hands. The A-10's backup flight controls were manual, requiring physical strength to move the control surfaces without hydraulic assistance. Novik had trained for this scenario, had practiced it in simulators, but the reality was brutally difficult. Every input required force that left her arms shaking. The aircraft responded sluggishly, fighting her on every maneuver. She declared an emergency, began the long process of nursing the Warthog toward Bagram while maintaining enough altitude to bail out if control became impossible. For 37 minutes, she wrestled with an aircraft that wanted to kill her, forcing it to stay in the sky through technique and physical strength, an absolute refusal to accept failure. She made it. The landing was hard enough to damage the landing gear, but she made it. The aircraft was declared a hangar queen, requiring extensive repairs before it could fly again. Novik walked away without serious injury, checked out by flight surgeons who expressed concern about the physical strain she'd endured. They recommended a medical evaluation, suggested she consider whether continuing to fly at her age was advisable. Novik nodded, agreed to all their recommendations, and returned to flight status 2 days later in a different A-10. The near-death experience had clarified something for her. She wasn't flying combat missions because she thought she was invincible or because she didn't understand the risks. She was flying because the alternative, a life without the promise and the purpose it provided, was worse than any danger she might face in the sky. Some people would call that unhealthy. Novik called it honest. News of the hydraulic failure reached the United States before Novik's official report. Commander Hayes, who'd maintained contact with her over the months since his initial visit, sent an email that was uncharacteristically direct. "Captain, at some point you're going to have to acknowledge that you're not indestructible. I know you love flying. I know the mission matters to you, but you've given enough. You've proven everything there is to prove. You can stop now. No one would think less of you." In fact, most of us would be relieved. Novik read the email 3 times, touched by the concern it represented but unable to make Hayes understand. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't operating from ego or denial. She simply knew who she was, and who she was required an A-10 and a mission and people on the ground who needed her. Without those things, she'd be someone else entirely. She wasn't ready to be someone else. Lieutenant Colonel Vance took a different approach. She grounded Novik for a week and required her to meet with a flight surgeon and a squadron psychologist. The evaluations were thorough, professional, and ultimately inconclusive. The flight surgeon found her physically capable of flight duties with minor age-related limitations. The psychologist noted a high level of commitment to the mission, but no evidence of suicidal ideation or impaired judgment. Both recommended continued monitoring but no immediate action. Vance read the reports, called Novik into her office, and spoke with unusual directness. "Captain, I'm not going to force you to stop flying. The regulations don't give me grounds to do that and your evaluations don't support it. But I need you to understand something. You've become important to people. The SEALs who you pulled out of that valley, the Marines you've supported on dozens of missions, the younger pilots in this squadron who have learned from watching you work, they all care about what happens to you. If you die in an aircraft, it's not just your loss. It's a loss for everyone who's invested in your survival. Think about that." Novik thought about it. She thought about Commander Hayes' email, about Lieutenant Colonel Vance's words, about the plaque from the SEAL team that she'd mounted on the wall of her quarters. She thought about the promise she'd made to herself 2 decades ago, and whether that promise had become an obsession that served no one. She thought about the younger pilots in the squadron, about whether she was modeling dedication or warning about the dangers of failing to know when to step aside. She thought about a lot of things during the week she was grounded. Then she returned to flight status and continued taking missions, because thinking about alternatives and accepting alternatives were different actions entirely. She would fly until they forced her to stop, until her body failed or the regulations caught up with her or the Air Force found a way to move her aside. Until then, she was requiem. The music hadn't stopped yet. The final year of Novik's service arrived with Afghanistan's perpetual autumn, when the heat broke and the mountains took on their bronze and gold coloring. She was 54 years old, had logged over 5,000 hours in the A-10, had flown more combat missions than most pilots in the Air Force's entire history. Her squadron had cycled through 3 different commanders during her time at Bagram. She trained dozens of pilots, supported hundreds of ground operations, and accumulated a collection of memories that she carefully avoided dwelling on because dwelling led to questioning, and questioning led to places she couldn't afford to go. The mandatory retirement age for pilots was approaching. She had 13 months left. After that, no amount of competence or commitment would matter. The regulations were absolute. She would turn 55 and she would be done. The younger pilots had started treating her differently, with a mixture of respect and something approaching awe. They'd ask her questions about her early deployments, about what flying was like before all the modern systems and precision guidance. They'd listen to her stories about missions in Iraq, about the differences between theaters and how tactics had evolved over 2 decades of continuous war. Novik found herself becoming the squadron historian, the keeper of institutional memory about an aircraft and a mission that had survived repeated attempts at elimination. She was the last of something, though she wasn't quite sure what. The last of the old-school pilots, maybe, the ones who'd learned to fly before computers did half the work. The last of the true believers in close air support as more than just a mission set but as a covenant with the people on the ground. The last pilot willing to sacrifice everything else in life, to keep flying combat missions long past the point where it made career or financial sense. Then came the mission that would end her career, though she didn't know it at the time. A joint special operations task force had cornered a high-value target in a compound near the Pakistan border. The raid was planned for maximum surprise, with no air support briefed because the noise of aircraft would compromise the element of surprise. The operators went in fast, aiming for a quick capture before the target could escape or activate whatever security measures he had in place. But the intelligence was incomplete. The compound was more heavily defended than expected. The operators found themselves in a sustained firefight with enemy combatants who were well-trained and well-equipped. Within 5 minutes, the operation had gone from surgical strike to desperate survival. They called for immediate air support. Novik and her wingman were the closest assets, 30 minutes away. They covered the distance in 22 minutes, pushing the A-10s to speeds they weren't designed to maintain. By the time Novik arrived overhead, the ground situation had deteriorated further. The Special Operations team had taken multiple casualties and was pinned down in a building that was taking RPG fire. The enemy had reinforcements arriving from nearby positions, threatening to surround and overwhelm the friendly forces. Novik assessed the tactical situation and realized immediately why no other aircraft had been assigned to this operation. The compound was in a residential area. There were civilians nearby, possibly in the target building itself. The rules of engagement were strict, the margin for error non-existent. Any pilot who put ordnance into that compound had to be absolutely certain of their target identification and their precision. One mistake would mean dead civilians and an international incident that would reverberate through the chain of command, all the way to the White House. Novik made 6 attack runs, each one more dangerous than the last. She used her cannon exclusively, the only weapon precise enough for the required targeting. She fired from angles that violated every safety guideline, getting low and slow to ensure absolute accuracy. Between runs, she coordinated with the ground commander, getting updated target information, confirming enemy positions, verifying that friendly forces were clear. The enemy started firing directly at her aircraft, recognizing that eliminating the air support was their best chance of overwhelming the operators. Novik took multiple hits, felt the impacts transmit through the airframe, kept flying. On her 7th run, a rocket-propelled grenade detonated close enough to her aircraft to pepper it with shrapnel. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel. Her wingman called for her to withdraw. Novik ignored him and made 2 more runs, finally suppressing enough enemy positions that the Special Operations team could break contact and withdraw with their casualties. The flight back to base was a repeat of the Kunar province mission, only worse. Novik had damage to both engines, compromised flight controls, and a fuel leak that was rapidly draining her reserves. She stayed airborne through a combination of skill and luck, landing at Bagram with almost no fuel and control surfaces that were barely responding. The aircraft was eventually determined to be beyond economical repair, so damaged that it would be cheaper to retire it than fix it. Novik climbed out of the cockpit for the last time, looked at the warthog that had brought her home despite everything, and understood that she'd finally pushed too far. The investigation this time was shorter but more consequential. The findings were clear. Novik had deliberately violated safety protocols, ignored her wingman's calls to withdraw, and taken risks that no reasonable pilot would accept. The ground force had survived because of her actions, but that didn't change the fact that her judgment had been dangerously flawed. The recommendation was equally clear. Captain Novik should be immediately removed from combat flying status and assigned to administrative duties for the remainder of her service. The notification came from Lieutenant Colonel Vance personally. She delivered it with visible regret, sitting across from Novik in the same office where they'd had so many previous conversations. "Captain, I fought this decision as hard as I could. I argued that your results speak for themselves, that you saved lives that would have been lost otherwise. But the safety board was unanimous. They can't ignore the pattern of risk-taking across multiple missions. You've been extraordinary, but you've also been lucky, and they don't want to wait around to see what happens when your luck runs out. You're grounded effective immediately. You'll finish your last few months in a staff position, probably working on training documentation or safety protocols. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted." Novik listened without expression, absorbing the words that meant her career was ending not with planned retirement but with involuntary removal from the cockpit. It was the ending she'd feared and expected, the inevitable consequence of refusing to compromise or moderate or accept any priority above the mission. She cleaned out her locker in the Squadron Operations Center, packed away her flight suit and her helmet and all the small items that had accumulated over 2 decades. Other pilots watched in silence, understanding that they were witnessing the end of an era. Novik carried everything to her quarters in 2 trips, stored it all in a footlocker that would eventually be shipped back to the States, and sat on her bunk staring at nothing in particular. She'd flown her last mission. She was still technically in the Air Force, still drawing her captain's salary and living on base, but the identity that had defined her adult life was gone. She was no longer Requiem. She was just Iris Novik, a 54-year-old woman with no particular purpose and 8 months until mandatory retirement. The transition was brutal in its abruptness, the loss more profound than she'd anticipated. Without the flying, without the promise, what was she? The next weeks were among the worst of Novik's life. She reported to her new assignment in the Wing's safety office, where she was tasked with reviewing accident reports and updating standard operating procedures. The work was important in an abstract sense, but it felt like being buried alive. She sat in an office, read documents, attended meetings, and tried not to think about the mission she wasn't flying, the pilots who were taking her place in the rotation, the people on the ground who might need her overhead. The other personnel in the safety office were professional and respectful, but they treated her like damaged goods, someone to be careful around because her failure was recent and visible. Novik endured their careful courtesy and focused on doing her assigned work competently, because competence was the only thing she still controlled. She would finish her service without complaints or drama. She would make the transition from pilot to retiree without making things more difficult for the people who had to manage her exit. It was the least she could do. Commander Hayes found out about her grounding through unofficial channels. He sent another email, this one longer and more personal than his previous messages. He wrote about watching her fly in the Kunar province, about how her performance that day had changed his understanding of what was possible. He wrote about the conversations he'd had with other ground force members, about the consistent theme that emerged from every story about A-10 pilots. They stayed when others left. They got dangerously close when precision mattered. They subordinated their own safety to the ground force's survival in ways that no other aircraft community matched. He wrote that Novik embodied all of that she'd been doing it longer and better than almost anyone else, and that her grounding was simultaneously entirely justified by the regulations and a profound loss for the community she'd served. "You kept the promise," Hayes wrote. "For 23 years, you kept it better than anyone had a right to expect. The fact that they had to force you to stop proves how completely you committed to it. I hope you can find peace with that. I hope you can understand that you did enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough. You don't owe anyone anything more." Novik read Hayes's email multiple times, trying to absorb its message. She wanted to believe that she'd done enough, that her service had been sufficient, that she could transition to retirement with some sense of completion. But the promise hadn't been transactional. She hadn't made it as a contract with specific terms and definable endpoints. She'd made it as an identity, as a fundamental statement about who she was and what she valued. Being forced to stop keeping the promise felt like being forced to stop being herself. She didn't know how to make peace with that. She didn't know how to be Iris Novik without being Requiem. The remaining months of her service stretched ahead like a desert, empty and featureless and endless. She would survive them because she'd survived everything else. But she wouldn't pretend to be grateful for the time or to find meaning in the safety office's work or to embrace the mandatory retirement as an earned rest. She would endure, and eventually it would be over. But the Air Force, in its institutional way, had one more surprise for Novik. 6 weeks after her grounding, she was informed that she'd been selected for the Air Force Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor. The recommendation that Commander Hayes had filed after the Kunar Province mission had been revived, supplemented with additional documentation from the recent mission near the Pakistan border. The review board had concluded that Novik's performance across multiple engagements demonstrated sustained valor under fire that warranted exceptional recognition. The medal would be presented at a ceremony at the Pentagon, with senior leadership and media attendance. It was exactly the kind of public recognition that Novik had spent her career avoiding, and now was being forced on her as a capstone to her service. She could refuse the medal, but that would create its own set of problems and probably hurt the people who'd worked to get her recognized. She could accept it grudgingly, but that would seem ungracious and diminish the achievement that others clearly felt was significant. She was trapped again, this time by success rather than failure, unable to simply fade into retirement quietly. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 weeks before her mandatory retirement date. The Air Force flew her back to the States, put her in dress uniform for the first time in months, and paraded her through a series of events that felt surreal. She met with senators who wanted to use her story to argue for increased defense spending. She gave interviews to reporters who wanted the human interest angle on the veteran pilot who'd served longer than most of her peers. She attended a dinner where senior officers toasted her service and told anecdotes about her career that were simultaneously accurate and fundamentally incomplete because they couldn't capture what the flying had meant to her. Through it all, Novik maintained the professional demeanor she'd perfected over decades, smiling when required, answering questions appropriately, playing the role that had been written for her. Inside, she felt like she was attending her own funeral, watching other people process her life into something comprehensible and publicly acceptable. The medal ceremony itself was brief and formal. A 3-star general read the citation, which detailed her actions in the Kunar province and the Pakistan border mission with the kind of clinical precision that military awards required. He praised her skill, her courage, her commitment to the ground forces she'd supported. He noted that her service represented the highest ideals of the Air Force and the close air support mission. Then he pinned the Air Force Cross to her uniform, while photographers captured the moment, and an audience of officers and dignitaries applauded. Novik stood at attention, accepted the medal, and said the brief remarks that had been prepared for her about honor and duty and the privilege of service. None of it felt real. The real moments had been in the cockpit, over Afghanistan, with Americans dying on the ground and her GAU-8 providing the only argument that mattered. This was theater, necessary perhaps, but disconnected from anything that mattered to her personally. After the ceremony, Commander Hayes found her in the reception hall. He looked at the Air Force cross on her uniform and smiled. "You earned that about 1,000 times over. I hope you know that." Novik touched the medal, felt its weight on her chest. "I earned it by breaking so many rules that they had to ground me. I earned it by being too stubborn to accept that maybe the regulations exist for good reasons. I'm not sure that's something to celebrate." Hayes shook his head. "Captain, the regulations exist to protect the average case, the normal situation, the 95% of missions that fit standard parameters. But there's always going to be that 5%, the impossible situations where following the rules means people die. When those situations arise, you need someone willing to break the rules, to accept the personal risk, to do what needs doing regardless of consequences. That's what you were. That's what this medal recognizes. Not rule-breaking for its own sake, but the wisdom to know when the rules don't apply and the courage to act on that knowledge." Novik wasn't entirely convinced, but she appreciated Hayes's attempt to frame her career in terms she could accept. They talked for a while longer, about the SEAL team from the Kunar province mission, about the broader state of close air support doctrine, about what Novik planned to do in retirement. She didn't have good answers to that last question. She'd spent so much of her life focused on flying that she'd never developed serious plans for afterwards. Maybe she'd find work as a civilian instructor pilot. Maybe she'd consult on aircraft development. Maybe she'd just disappear into quiet obscurity and try to figure out who Iris Novik was when she wasn't Requiem. Hayes suggested she take time before making any decisions, advice that was sensible and entirely unhelpful. Novik nodded, promised to stay in touch, and extricated herself from the reception as soon as she could do so without being overtly rude. She had 3 more weeks of active service. She intended to spend them preparing for an ending she still didn't fully accept. The final 3 weeks passed in a blur of administrative processing. Novik out-processed through medical, through personnel, through all the various offices that needed to certify that she was ready for retirement. She attended her final flight physical, which was purely ceremonial since she was no longer on flying status. She cleaned out her permanent records, signed documents that transferred her to retired status, and made decisions about benefits and healthcare that seemed simultaneously important and irrelevant. Through it all, she maintained her professional demeanor, answered questions when asked, and avoided discussing her feelings about the transition with anyone who asked. The feelings were complicated, contradictory, and not suitable for public consumption. She was simultaneously relieved that the long struggle to stay flying was over, and devastated that she'd lost the thing that had given her life meaning. She was proud of her service and ashamed of how it had ended. She was grateful for recognition and resentful of the visibility. She was, in short, a mess of contradictions that no one really wanted to hear about. Her last day of active service was a Friday in November, unseasonably warm in Washington, D.C. Novik wore her dress uniform one final time, attended a small retirement ceremony at the Pentagon where her squadron commander and a few senior officers said kind things about her career. There was a plaque, a folded flag, and brief remarks that she barely heard. Then it was over. She was retired, no longer Captain Novik but just Iris, a veteran with a lot of memories and an uncertain future. She changed into civilian clothes in the Pentagon bathroom, packed her uniform into a garment bag, and walked out of the building for the last time. The November afternoon was beautiful, all gold light and clear skies. Overhead, she heard the familiar sound of jet engines, some Air Force pilot flying a mission somewhere. Novik looked up, watched the contrails form against the blue, and felt the loss hit her with renewed force. Someone else was up there now. Someone else was keeping the promise. She was on the ground permanently, irrevocably. The music had finally stopped. The first 6 months of retirement were difficult in ways Novik hadn't anticipated. The structured days of military service were replaced by empty hours that she struggled to fill meaningfully. She'd rented an apartment near Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, drawn there by proximity to the A-10 community even though she could no longer be part of it. She took long walks in the desert, read extensively, and tried to develop interests beyond aviation. Nothing took. She'd attend social events for retired military personnel and find she had nothing to say to people whose service had ended years or decades earlier. She'd visit the base occasionally, watch A-10s take off and land, and feel like a ghost haunting her own past. Friends and former colleagues reached out periodically, checking on her, inviting her to things. Novik appreciated the gestures but found she couldn't engage authentically. The person they wanted to connect with, the competent and committed pilot who'd kept the promise for 23 years, didn't exist anymore. What remained was someone she didn't particularly understand or like. Then, 8 months into retirement, Novik received a phone call from a program manager at Boeing. The company was developing next-generation close air support aircraft and wanted to hire her as a consultant. They needed someone who understood the mission requirements from a pilot's perspective, who could evaluate proposed systems and tactics from the ground force's viewpoint. The work would be part-time, mostly remote, with occasional trips to testing facilities and program reviews. It would pay well, and more importantly, it would give her a way to stay connected to close air support without the physical demands of combat flying. Novik accepted the position before the program manager finished his pitch. She needed purpose more than money, needed some way to keep serving the mission even if she could no longer fly it personally. The consulting work wouldn't be the same as strapping into an A-10, but it was something. It was a way to keep the promise in a different form. The work proved more engaging than Novik expected. She reviewed design proposals, evaluated weapons systems, and participated in discussions about the future of close air support in an era of near-peer competition and advanced air defenses. Her perspective, grounded in decades of actual combat experience, was unusual in communities that often prioritize theoretical performance over operational reality. She found herself arguing for capabilities that seemed mundane but were essential. Long loiter time, heavy armor, weapons that worked in bad weather and poor visibility, radios that could talk to ground controllers under any conditions. The engineers and program managers listened respectfully, sometimes incorporated her feedback, sometimes explained why the requirements she thought were critical weren't feasible given budget or technology constraints. Novik learned to navigate these conversations, to push for what mattered while accepting what was possible. She would never have the influence she'd had in a cockpit, but she could still shape how the next generation of pilots would execute the mission. 2 years into retirement, Novik returned to Afghanistan as a civilian contractor, hired to evaluate close air support operations and make recommendations for improving effectiveness. The war was winding down, American forces withdrawing gradually, but people were still dying and missions were still being flown. Novik spent 6 weeks embedded with an A-10 squadron at Bagram, the same base she'd flown from during her final deployments. Walking the flight line, seeing the aircraft she'd once commanded, talking to pilots young enough to be her children, she felt the loss acutely. She wanted to be flying these missions. She wanted to be keeping the promise directly rather than observing others keep it. But her body was 57 years old, her reflexes had slowed, and the regulations were absolute. She couldn't fly combat missions anymore. She could only watch, evaluate, and try to help the people who'd taken her place. One afternoon, she met with a young captain named Morrison, call sign Falcon like Webb had been. Morrison was talented, aggressive, and clearly being groomed for leadership. He'd read about Novik, knew her call sign and her story, and treated her with the slightly uncomfortable deference that came from meeting someone whose reputation exceeded human scale. They talked about tactics, about the challenges of providing support in an era when the enemy had increasingly sophisticated weapons. Morrison asked about the Kunar province mission, about how Novik had maintained precision while taking fire. Novik tried to explain, found that the words were inadequate. How do you convey 23 years of accumulated skill and judgment? How do you transfer the instincts that only develop through repetition and survival? She did her best, shared what insights she could, and hoped that something useful survived the translation. At the end of their conversation, Morrison said, "Ma'am, I hope when my career ends, I'll have done half as much as you did. You set a standard that's going to be hard to match." Novik didn't know how to respond to that. The evaluation work brought Novik back to the United States with mixed feelings. The A-10 pilots were competent, dedicated, and well-trained. The aircraft remained effective despite its age. The close air support mission continued to save lives. Everything was functioning as it should. But Novik couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the institutional commitment to the mission had weakened. The Air Force was still trying to retire the A-10, still arguing that resources should be allocated to other platforms and missions. The pilots who'd replaced her generation were fighting the same battles she'd fought, trying to prove the value of something that should have been self-evident to anyone who understood ground combat. Novik wrote her report carefully, documenting capabilities and limitations, making recommendations that she knew would be partially implemented at best. Then she submitted it, collected her consultant fee, and returned to her apartment in Tucson to figure out what came next. What came next was teaching. The Air Force invited Novik to serve as a guest lecturer at the weapons school, sharing her combat experience with the service's best and brightest pilots. She accepted, nervous about standing in front of an audience and talking about herself. But once she started, the words came easily. She talked about the Kunar province mission, about the decisions she'd made and why she'd made them. She talked about the Pakistan border operation, about accepting risk when the alternative was accepting casualties. She talked about 23 years of flying the A-10, about the evolution of tactics and threats, about the constant struggle to balance safety with effectiveness. The students listened with intense attention, asking questions that showed they understood what she was really teaching, not specific tactics that could be memorized, but a mindset about the mission and its priorities. After her first lecture, several students approached her privately to say that she'd articulated things they'd felt but couldn't express. One young lieutenant said, "You gave us permission to care more about the ground force than the regulations. I didn't know I needed that permission until you said it." Novik went home that day feeling like she'd accomplished something meaningful for the first time since retirement. The teaching became regular. Novik gave lectures at the weapons school, at various training programs, occasionally at universities studying military doctrine. She wrote articles for professional journals, sharing insights about close air support that could only come from extensive combat experience. She became a recognized expert, someone whose opinion carried weight in discussions about the A-10's future and the broader questions about how to conduct air support in challenging environments. It wasn't the same as flying. It would never be the same as flying. But it was a way to keep serving, to keep the promise in a different form. The music hadn't stopped. It had just changed tempo and instrument. Novik could live with that most days. Some days it even felt like enough. 5 years into retirement, Novik received a letter from one of the Marines she'd supported during her last combat deployment. The Marine, now a sergeant, wrote that he'd been thinking about the mission where Novik had provided fire support during an ambush. He'd been 22 then, terrified, convinced he was going to die. He remembered the sound of the A-10's gun, remembered the enemy fire that had been shredding their position suddenly stopping, remembered the moment when he realized he was going to survive. "I'm 28 now," the sergeant wrote. "I've been married for 2 years. My daughter was born 6 months ago. I named her Iris after you. I wanted her to carry the name of the person who made it possible for me to be her father. I wanted you to know that your service had consequences beyond the mission, beyond the statistics. Because of what you did that day, my daughter exists. Because of you, I got to build a life. Thank you doesn't seem adequate, but thank you anyway. Thank you for keeping the promise." Novik read the letter 3 times, tears running down her face. This was what it had all been for. Not the medals or the recognition or the career progression she'd never achieved. This, a life that wouldn't have existed without her willingness to fly into danger and stay there until the situation was resolved. A daughter named Iris who would grow up never knowing how close her father had come to dying in an Afghan valley. This was the promise kept, the music that mattered. Novik put the letter in a frame on her wall, next to the plaque from the SEAL team and her Air Force Cross. These were the things that measured her service, not the flight hours or the mission counts, but the lives that continued because she'd been overhead when it mattered. She was 59 years old, 5 years removed from her last combat mission, and she finally understood that she'd done enough. She'd given everything that could reasonably be asked and more than was probably wise. She'd kept the promise as completely as any human could. The rest of her life, whatever form it took, was grace. The Air Force retired the A-10 in phases over the next decade, as Novik moved through her 60s. Each retirement ceremony felt personal, as if they were burying pieces of her past along with the aircraft. She attended several, watched warthogs that she'd flown get towed to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan, tried to reconcile herself to the inevitable. All weapon systems eventually became obsolete, replaced by newer technology and different doctrine. The A-10 had lasted longer than most, had proved itself in combat repeatedly, but time and politics and budget priorities were forces that even the best aircraft couldn't overcome. Novik understood that intellectually. Emotionally, watching the aircraft she'd dedicated her life to being systematically eliminated was harder than she'd expected. It felt like watching her own death in slow motion, seeing the world move on from everything she'd valued and believed in. But close air support continued, executed by different aircraft and new generations of pilots. The mission persisted even as the platforms changed. Novik took some comfort in that, in the knowledge that the promise was being kept even if the tools had evolved. She maintained contact with younger pilots, answered their questions, shared her experiences when asked. She became a living link to the early days of the War on Terror, to the tactics and lessons that had been learned through hard experience. Universities and think tanks consulted her on studies about military aviation. Documentary filmmakers interviewed her about the A-10's legacy. Slowly, without intending to, she became the keeper of a particular kind of institutional memory, the person who remembered what close air support had been before it became what it was now. It was a responsibility she accepted reluctantly, but took seriously. At 70, Novik published a memoir. She'd resisted writing it for years, uncomfortable with the self-focus that memoir required. But younger veterans kept asking for her story, kept saying they needed to understand how someone maintained commitment across such a long career. Finally, she agreed, working with a co-author who helped her organize decades of experiences into something coherent. The book was titled Requiem, A Pilot's Promise, and it detailed her service with the honesty she'd always tried to maintain. She wrote about the missions that succeeded and the ones that failed. She wrote about the cost of complete commitment, the relationships she'd sacrificed, the person she'd become. She wrote about the promise and what it had meant to keep it across 23 years of combat. The book was published to positive reviews, found an audience among military personnel and civilians interested in understanding military service. Novik did minimal promotion, gave a few interviews, and then stepped back to let the work speak for itself. The book's success brought renewed attention. Novik received letters from veterans who'd served in different eras and different services, but recognized something of themselves in her story. She received emails from young people considering military service who wanted to know if the commitment was worth it. She received invitations to speak at events, to participate in programs, to be visible in ways she'd spent her career avoiding. At 71, she was more famous than she'd been during her active service, her story having achieved the kind of retrospective recognition that often comes years after the actual events. Novik found it all faintly absurd. She was an old woman living alone in Arizona, teaching occasional classes and consulting on projects that interested her. The person people wanted to meet, the legendary pilot who'd kept flying against all obstacles, existed only in the past. She was just Iris now, trying to figure out what the last chapters of her life should contain. Then, on a spring morning when Novik was 72, she received a call from the Air Force. They were dedicating a new close air support training facility at Davis-Monthan, and they wanted to name it after her. The Iris Novik Close Air Support Center would train pilots across all platforms, focusing on the principles she'd exemplified during her career: precision, persistence, and absolute commitment to the ground force. Would she agree to have the facility named in her honor? Would she attend the dedication ceremony? Novik's first instinct was to refuse, to say that she didn't deserve that kind of recognition. But she thought about the young pilots who would train there, about the missions they would fly, about the lives they would save. If putting her name on the facility helped them understand what the mission really required, then her discomfort was irrelevant. "Yes," she told the Air Force officer on the phone. "I'll be there, and thank you for keeping the promise alive." The dedication ceremony was held on a clear day in October, perfect Arizona, weather that made everything sharp and bright. Novik stood before a crowd of active-duty pilots, retired veterans, and senior leadership, and gave brief remarks about the importance of close air support and the responsibility it carried. She talked about the promise, about staying on station, and prioritizing the ground force above all other considerations. She talked about the pilots who would train at this facility, about the faith that ground forces would place in them. "When they call you," she said, "when they're pinned down and taking casualties and you're the only thing between them and disaster, you go, you stay. You keep the music playing until everyone who can be saved has been saved. That's the job. That's the promise. Keep it and everything else will take care of itself." Then they unveiled the dedication plaque, and Novik saw her name in bronze letters. Captain Iris Novik, USAF Ret, call sign Requiem below that, who stayed on station. After the ceremony, a young captain approached Novik. She introduced herself as Captain Sarah Chen, an A-10 pilot on her first operational assignment. "Ma'am," Chen said, "I read your book. I've studied your missions. I need you to know that every time I fly, I ask myself what you would do in the situation. You set a standard that I'm trying to meet. I just wanted to thank you for showing us what's possible." Novik looked at this young pilot, saw her own intensity and commitment reflected back across 4 decades, and felt something inside her ease. The promise would be kept. It would be kept by Captain Chen and thousands of other pilots she'd never meet, in situations she'd never know about, for as long as there were people on the ground who needed someone overhead. Her part was finished, but the music would continue. Requiem would play long after she was gone. That was enough. That was more than enough. "Captain Chen," Novik said, "just do your best. That's all anyone can ask. Do your best and keep the promise. The rest will follow." Novik died at 78 in her sleep in her apartment in Tucson. She was found by a neighbor, still at peace, having lived just long enough to see the promise continue into a new generation. Her funeral was attended by hundreds: pilots she'd flown with, ground force members she'd supported, students she'd taught, and people whose connection to her was simply that she'd inspired them to serve with greater commitment. Commander Hayes, now retired and in his 60s, gave a eulogy that captured something essential about who she'd been. "Iris Novik kept a promise that no one asked her to make," he said. "She gave everything to people she'd never met, stayed in danger when safety was available, and never counted the cost to herself. She was the best of us, and we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to live up to her example." They buried her with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, her Air Force cross glinting in the sunlight, the sound of aircraft overhead. A-10 Thunderbolts flew the missing man formation at her funeral, 4 aircraft in close formation with one breaking away and climbing toward the sky, leaving an empty space where Requiem used to fly. The symbolism was obvious and necessary, a final acknowledgement of the pilot who'd stayed on station longer than anyone. As the aircraft faded into the distance and the formation reformed, someone in the crowd began to applaud. Others joined, and soon the entire assembly was clapping, a standing ovation for a woman who'd spent her life refusing recognition. The applause continued for nearly 5 minutes, an outpouring of respect that Novik would have found deeply uncomfortable and probably undeserved. But she was beyond discomfort now, beyond the need to deflect or minimize. The promise had been kept. The music had played for 55 years, from her first flight as a young lieutenant to her last breath as a retired captain. And even now, with her gone, the music continued. In cockpits over distant battlefields, pilots she'd trained and pilots who'd only heard her story were keeping faith with ground forces who needed them. They stayed on station. They kept the promise. Requiem lived on, not in one person but in a commitment that transcended any individual life. That was her legacy. That was her immortality. That finally was enough.